Hello, it is I, your book reviewer, back for the third installment of Stephen King's Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is right there. And so let's get started. The first story that I'm going to do today is a book called It Grows on You. This, in the audiobook, was written by Stephen King, or read by Stephen King, excuse me. It is about a house in a Maine town, and the house and its owner, a man named Joe Newell, are kind of odd little creatures. Joe initially bought the house and built it for his wife, and the as he started to build, the townspeople started to think, okay, this is a really ugly house, and Joe's kind of eccentric kind of guy, but if you look at the house long enough, it kind of grows on you, as people mainly use that term and as the title for the story. And throughout the years, Joe has built new things for his house. He builds trestles and extended bedrooms, and he builds barns and silos and things like that for the house. And eventually, his wife dies, and he still sort of builds this kind of mourning period and things like that. But then Joe eventually dies, and so the townspeople think, oh, this house is going to stop building. And even though since Joe has died, nobody's living in the house and they're not able to sell it to anyone. But in spite of all that, at the end of the story, the house starts building up again. So they're realizing, oh no, either somebody's building it from the inside and they don't know about it, or most likely it's building itself. So the house is building on itself. So I liked it. Um, it was again a very interesting story. Unfortunately it took kind of a couple times for me to read to understand it fully, but I recommend it for that. The second story is called The Fifth Quarter. It was read by Gary Sinise, and if you remember me talking about the TNT TV movie version of Nightmares and Dreamscapes, this is one that was on there. I ended up liking the movie version better than the book because, let me explain. The book was about a four people who were involved in a bank robbery, and they got all this money, and they buried it, and they made themselves a map to see where this money was, and they had divided it into quarters. And but then there was this other man who had heard about, he wasn't involved in the robbery, but he had heard about it, and he was like, I'm going to get this money because I can and I'm entitled to it. And so he kills each one of the people and takes their quarter of the map, which, because he was the fifth man involved, is why this story is called The Fifth Quarter. So he does, and you don't, throughout the end of the book, you don't know if you see him going to the map site, but you don't see him or read about him actually getting the treasure. The reason why I like the story, the TV version, better is because it involves his wife or his girlfriend, who's not mentioned in the book, and she ends up getting the treasure. So I thought that was kind of cute, and they paint off like she really needed it for money issues, but I liked that better. The next story is called You Know They've Got a Hell of a Band, and was read by, excuse me for a second, Grace Slick. And if you are familiar with the kind of oldies song, Rock and Roll Heaven, and there's a line in it that says, in rock and roll heaven, you know they got a hell of a band, which is how that song started, and or how that story got its title, excuse me. And it starts out with a couple who are vacationing, and they're driving to this vacation site, and they get lost. And so they stumble upon this town called Rock and Roll Heaven. And they stop into a little cafe and ask for directions and kind of sit there and get a bite to eat and things like that. And the woman of the couple is starting to look around the townspeople and noticing that they're looking like a lot of things like celebrities who have died. She mentions there's Ricky Nelson, there's Buddy Holly, that she thinks she sees, there's Janis Joplin, and so she's like, this is kind of insane. This is like, we gotta get out of here. And So she and her husband go and try to escape the town, but the road outside of the town is blocked by a bus, and so they have to stop. And the mayor of this town, kind of like the king of this rock and roll heaven, is undoubtedly, of course, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. And he's like, "No, where are you going? We got a show that we're gonna do tonight. You gotta stay for the show." And so they, they're kind of forced into it. They're like, there's no way that they're gonna let us leave. So they go to the show, and they do run into other people who had stumbled upon this town, and they're like, "Well, how long have you been there?" And like, "Well, we don't know. You kind of time just kind of loses itself in this rock and roll heaven." So I thought it was really good because of all the dead people that they thought that they saw. And so it's kind of cute. And again, that was also in the TNT TV movie, so that one was good too. The next book is called The Night Flyer. This is a vampire story where it basically resembles around this man named Richard Dees, who is he kind of works for like a TMZ type magazine, and he's a photographer. And all of the journalists in this town have said, "Okay, we've heard this thing about a night flyer. Is he a man or is he a vampire? Because you hear about this man who's a pilot and piloting planes and going to different airports and actually killing the people inside." So Richard, who has a pilot's license, decides he's gonna kind of track this night flyer down from airport to airport and try to see if he catches up with him. He eventually does, and one of the best lines from the story is Richard is in a men's room, and this is the vampire story where it's kind of a typical what you know about vampires. They can't go out in sunlight, and they can't show reflections in a mirror. So he's in a men's room, and he's standing by the sinks, and he hears somebody using a urinal, but he doesn't see them in the reflection. So he's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the room with the night flyer." The line is basically, "I am actually watching the night flyer take a piss." Excuse my language, but it was awesome. And so he has a conversation with the night flyer, and that kind of ensues. I won't spoil the ending for you, but it was a good book. Along with It Grows on You, it kind of took me a little bit to read. I'm not really, except for Twilight, I didn't like that, but I'm not really fond of vampire stories, so there you go. So with that in mind, the next story is called Popsy, and that was read by Joe Mantegna, who is most often known in this kind of generation as the voice of Fat Tony in The Simpsons. So just imagining Fat Tony just tell a story, and that's kind of the voice he used. It's also a vampire story. It's about a man named Sheridan who, to pay off a gambling debt, has to abduct a kid, and take it to these people that he owes the debt to. And so he picks a child at random at a mall, and he finds a little boy who claims that he's looking for his Popsy, and Sheridan thinks he's talking about his dad or his grandpa. And he's like, "Oh, trying to be all friendly, like, "Oh, I'll take you to him. He's over there. I saw him. Like, I'll take you to your Popsy." And so he eventually gets him into the car and straps him in, and the kid's flailing because he realizes, "Oh my gosh, I'm stuck." And so Sheridan thinks he just got to drop off this kid and he'll be great. But this kid's wailing for his Popsy, "Please, Popsy, come get me, come get me." So Sheridan is driving down the road, and all of a sudden, this big wing drapes across his windshield, and he's like, "Oh my gosh." And so he has to stop suddenly and pull over. And then you realize that this winged creature is the boy's Popsy, who is this vampire, this kind of grandfatherly vampire, who grabs Sheridan, is like, we were just in this mall, or we were just in the store because I wanted to buy my son a comic book, or I wanted to buy him a toy, and you ruined it for us. Now you must pay. And so Sheridan realizes that he's done for, and the last few moments are fun for Sheridan. So that's it for that book. I enjoyed that book. That was probably one of my favorite books of this little section. Okay. And the next story is called Sorry Right Number, which is a full dramatization play. And it kind of takes a little off of the Sorry Wrong Number that you might be a little more familiar with. But what it is about a woman who is having an evening with her family, and she gets a call. And the person on the other end is really frantic, but she doesn't hear much on the other end. All she hears is, "Please take." And it's very frantic and very like, "Oh my gosh, you need to help me." But then the call dies. Or the phone gets disconnected, excuse me. And so this woman is like frantically going, "Oh my gosh, somebody's trying to call me, and I think I know the number or the name. The voice sounds so familiar." So she calls her daughter, who's away at school, and her daughter's fine. And she calls her mother's fine. She calls her sisters are fine. So she's like, well, maybe I just chalked it off of somebody I heard, somewhere else. So she goes to bed, but her husband doesn't. And she wakes up in like 2 a.m. and goes down to find her husband, and he has died of a heart attack. And so then the next scene in the play is that it's 5 years later, and her oldest daughter, who is away at school, is getting married. And the woman has remarried somebody else, and so they live in a whole new house and things like that. So then after the wedding, they're back at home, and she finds herself alone and hearing a voice that she realizes is her first husband, and her first husband is going, "Who do you want to call? You want to call somebody. Who do you want to call?" And so she finds herself dialing her old number back from 5 years ago, and finding herself 5 years ago answering the phone and hearing her saying, "Please take," and then again the phone dies. So you realize it's her calling herself 5 years ago, and what she's trying to say is, "Please take your husband to the hospital. He's having a heart attack." And of course it doesn't happen because the line was disconnected. But that was eerie, that was scary, that was real fun to hear actually on an audio story in the car. So I'm like, oh my gosh, this is fun. So that was a fun book. The last book is called The 10 O'Clock People. It was about people who, in office buildings, who have to go outside to smoke. And one of the ones who has to do that is starting to realize that his coworkers and other people around him who are sitting outside smoking quickly change, their faces quickly change into like this alien form. And so he finds other people in his building and around the neighborhood who have noticed it but have not changed. And he said, well, he realizes that these people are quickly changing from human to kind of alien, and that there's more of them happening as time wears on. So people who have not yet formed are forming a vigilante group and saying, we got to bring these down. This is way too scary. So and that erupts with fun ensuing with battles between the aliens and the humans. So I didn't like that book so much because I'm not, again, kind of like vampires, I'm not really an alien liker. Not really kind of science fiction-y stories. So, but no, regardless, that was a book that Stephen King wrote, so I read it. That's it for this edition of, and I finished now, finally, of Nightmares and Dreamscapes. I'm sorry it took so long. So, the next few books that I'm going to read are more non-fiction. I'm going to start with The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman. There we go. And also, after that, I'm going to do an autobiography and maybe a biography. So, I bid you all a good evening and happy reading. And prepare to comment if you'd like.